Thanks 3IE for inviting me to present this work. So here we are looking at impact of interventions which target women's empowerment at the community level on human development in low and middle income countries. So as you mentioned, this is a part of a GROW project which is based at the University of Göttingen. We also work closely with 3IE. Thanks to Hugh and some other colleagues. They helped us, in quality assurance of the review, and also designing and implementation of the search strategy. We used the 3IE risk of bias tool, so thanks for that. So what we are specifically looking at here is the effect of interventions which target women's empowerment at the community level and their effect on human development. Okay, so there are three specific questions we seek to address here. One is, what is the effect of such interventions on human development? Then what are the pathways through which these interventions might be, the effect of these interventions might be in place? And what are the institutional factors that act as a catalyst, maybe positive or maybe negative, in the effectiveness of these interventions? Okay, so this is the theory of change. It looks a little complicated, and it is. So we are looking at interventions which target women's empowerment at the community level. Okay, so these sort of interventions can be categorized broadly in four groups. One is support for agricultural activities, then support for entrepreneurship, improving financial access in terms of microfinance or reducing barriers for formal finance, then promotion of female labor force participation. Okay, so these are broadly the four categories of interventions we are looking at. Then our outcome of focus is human development, which is essentially a multidimensional concept. So we look at human development in terms of four dimensions. The first is the most widely used income or wealth dimension at the household level. Then we also look at health, education, and subjective well-being dimensions. So the subjective well-being dimension would include changes in attitude towards women at the community level, for example. So this is basically the intervention and the outcome. And there is a lot of things which would happen in between, right? These are called the channels. So there are some direct and some indirect channels through which these interventions may have an effect on these outcomes. For example, the interventions can reduce variability in income. They can increase female bargaining power, which is a first order effect towards empowerment. It could decrease fertility, increase households consumption, increase investment in girls' schooling. So these could lead to better outcomes in terms of health and education. So this is basically the theory of change. Now, this is a work in progress, as Hugh already said. So currently we have included 35 studies based on our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So of the included studies, this is the risk of bias analysis. So there are various sorts of risks of bias because we are looking at the effect, the causal effect of some interventions on some outcomes. So there are various types of bias that can be problematic in interpreting these effects. So there are two things that I want to highlight from this analysis. The first is the bias due to confounders and sample selection, which is basically hinders us from interpreting these effects as causal effects. So we find that there is a bunch of studies which have these problems, and most of these studies are quasi-experimental setup. So these are not experimental studies. Then there are other sort of biases like spillover and outcome reporting biases. So there are also a substantial number of studies on them. So this color is a little deceptive because the green represents high risk of bias. So we find that mostly RCTs have high risk of bias in terms of spillover and selective outcome reporting. Okay, now let me present a couple of results on outcomes. So this is the income dimension that I talked about, and this is looking at all the interventions together. So we find a significant positive effect. So these are various measures of income, income from land, wage, business, and other activities. We find positive and significant effect in all of them. And when we synthesize the effect size, we find again a positive and significant effect, but the effect size is very small. So this is the final outcome, one dimension of human development. Then if we look at the mediators, the most important is probably a measure of women's empowerment. We indeed find positive effect on women's empowerment as well. So probably the effect on income is channeled through women's empowerment. However, the effect size is again very small. And another interesting thing to note here is, so we can measure empowerment at the community level and at the household level, say decision-making power, right? We find that the effect at the family level or at the household level is much larger than the effect at the community level. So it seems that it's easier to improve empowerment within the household as compared to at the community level. So which is again plausible, because at the community there are gender norms, so it may be more difficult to change those norms. Okay, some additional results, but again these are all preliminary. So we find positive and significant effect of these interventions on employment, income security, school enrollment, and subjective well-being measures. However, we do not find any effect on relatively longer term outcomes such as assets, savings, or health outcomes. Then when we look at the different types of interventions, we find that some interventions target only women and some interventions target both men and women. And when they target both men and women, the effect sizes are relatively higher. Then finally, we find that these interventions that promote female labor force participation, they indeed increase women's employment. However, there is also an adverse effect on women's health. So this suggests that there can be some sort of triple burden of work that women have to deal with. Okay, so that's all about results. Now I'm going to talk about a few challenges that we face in doing this systematic review, and which are also probably applicable in broader context in general systematic review approach of synthesizing evidence. So what we find is there are multiple outcomes and multiple interventions. So in our systematic review, a final objective could be to understand which interventions work better relatively, right? But the problem is different interventions and different studies within the same intervention, they report various sorts of outcomes which are often not comparable. So if we indeed compare across interventions, which I have not done yet or I have not shown you in terms of results, but indeed if we find that there is a difference in various sorts of interventions, but the outcome measures are different, then we cannot really say whether this difference is arising because the interventions have different effectiveness or because they measure different sorts of outcomes. Okay, so there is a problem in interpreting those effects. For example, in this case, I have shown so some of the outcomes. For example, this is in the health dimension. We can talk about physical health and mental health, and there are all sorts of outcomes through which we can capture physical health dimension and mental health dimensions, and different studies report different outcomes. Then we have multiple interventions. So what we do here is we categorize similar outcomes into broad categories like mental health or physical health, but the underlying measures are very different. Okay, so the validity of analysis and interpretation depends on how comparable are these outcome measures within the same outcome construct. So one potential solution to this problem could be we can ask those researchers who collect primary data, for example experimental studies, randomized controlled trials, they may be asked to collect data on similar sets of outcomes. Okay, but so then it may help us in evaluating the outcome and synthesizing the effects by looking at similar sets of outcomes. But that is difficult to do in quasi-experimental studies which use secondary data, because there is a problem, they are constrained by availability of data. So this is something to reflect on when we are moving one step further and not only looking at one intervention and one specific outcomes and trying to synthesize the evidence, but also trying to go broader and looking at different sets of interventions and trying to compare which are more effective. So then these issues become quite important. Thank you.